My name is Lisa Osipenko, I head Consilium Scientific, and I welcome you to our second HTA in regulation event. And today, we're welcoming back our regular panel. You can read everyone's biographies online, and I'll be chairing today's event. And today we also have two special guests. We have Rob Hemmings, who is a medical statistician and epidemiologist with over 20 years of experience in regulatory field, working for MHRA and for the European Medicines Agency as a rapporteur. And for 8 years, Rob was a chair of the Scientific Advice Working Party. We're also joined by Dr. Rick Bremen from University of Utrecht. And Rick has a PhD in health technology assessment, and he's a special advisor for ZIN, which is the Dutch Health Technology Assessment Agency. So the focus of today is HTA and regulation. I will give a very brief presentation, and then we can turn to our panel for the discussion. We're waiting for your questions, for your comments. You can put them in the chat box. You can raise your hand and turn your camera on to ask a question. But during the event, I would appreciate if you could mute your microphones and please turn off your cameras if you are not speaking. All right. So FDA and European Medicine Agency are two big brand names. Everyone knows these names, and this is the big first hurdle for any pharmaceutical company willing to bring the product to market. And a yes from FDA and EMA is opening a bottle of champagne, throwing stock prices up. It's a huge step for any medicinal product and for devices and diagnostics products that go through the FDA as a green light to get to the market. And there are many other regulatory agencies. They have different power, they play different roles because, of course, European agencies are collaborating closely with EMA. Other regulatory agencies have more power because they're responsible for the actual regulation within their countries, such as Health Canada, MHRA in the UK, Australian agency, Japanese agency, Chinese agency, Indian agency. So pretty much every country has some kind of regulatory system that looks for the first step to allow products into the market. The second hurdle is the health technology assessment agencies. And this is kind of a new kid on the block. For the last 20 years, HTA agencies have been growing in their power, their capacity, their presence, and many countries are dreaming of establishing HTA capacity. Some countries have been trailblazers. So, and the agencies are collaborating with each other through European UNETA. In Spain, agencies are uniting now, and there are even across the ocean collaborations between HTA agencies. This is just a highlight of some of the agencies, but of course there are a lot more. Pretty much every European country has a form of HTA capacity these days. So very clear distinction between the remits of each agency. So the regulators are responsible for safety and efficacy of the medicinal products. If they look at the devices, they have to look at performance and safety. And this is it, because the other part, which deals with comparative therapeutic benefit, which deals with value for money, is on the shoulders of HTA and payers. And this system looks very logical because everyone has their own tasks. It's a sequential model. HTAs come into play after the regulator makes a decision. It can be immediate, it can be with a delay, but the regulators come to the picture first. How well does this model work is another question. And one of the first questions I'm posing today to our panel is how functional, how balanced, and how appropriate is the current system when fundamentally regulators and HTAs have different processes and goals. The second question I'm posing to our panel is if regulatory and HTA agencies are fulfilling such different remits, are they enabling an environment that effectively serves the needs of the society? We also have collaboration between, not just among the HTA agencies, but between regulators and HTA. And this has been on and off process with years of successful collaboration and with quiet periods. So we had very successful years of parallel scientific advice. Quite a few agencies adapted their timelines to work together and make sure that regulatory and HTA decisions are issued as close together as possible. But it also depends which agency you represent, which jurisdiction you live in, because sometimes the gap between the agencies and decisions is very wide. So the next bit of questions for our panel is whether regulators and HTAs are becoming collaborative partners, or in the reality, they are uncomfortable inevitabilities for each other. And whose interest does this interaction actually serve? And lately, we had a lot of publications, many press releases where regulators got under fire for many legitimate reasons, or sometimes not very legitimate reasons, but particularly the approval of Aduhelm, the Alzheimer's drug, lately got the FDA very much criticized. That this drug should not have been approved based on the evidence it had. There is a lot of critique for regulatory agencies for lowering the bar in oncology specifically, but it is also the case with many other medications which are coming to market without convincing clinical evidence packages, with suboptimal trial evidence, with very short trial duration, with surrogate outcomes. And there are multiple pressures. And these pressures come from patient groups, these pressures come from industry, these pressures come from the system and politicians who do want to bring innovation to market, who do want to bring new treatments, who do want to move the economy forward. So, and some inventions we've had recently, some gene therapies that came to market, a few cancer drugs, they did make a huge difference and important steps. And there were a lot of medications that entered the market at exorbitant prices, which bring no clinical benefits to patients. Health technology assessment agencies have to deal with whatever comes their way after the regulatory decision. So my last two questions for the panel are, what should HTAs do as evidence packages are becoming more and more questionable and the volumes of submissions increases? And what can be done to improve the regulator-HTA interaction to make it better serve patients and the public? This is all for me. I'm now opening the floor to our distinguished panel. So, and I'm giving the first word to our guest experts, to Rob and Rick. Who wants to start?
Rob, you can go ahead.
Oh, that's very kind of you, Rick. No, very, very happy to. Thanks, Lisa, and pleasure to be a part of the panel. I guess I'm here as an ex-regulator, emphasizing X, so I'm not speaking anymore on behalf of a regulator. And I'm going to give a caveat that I'm not an expert in HTA. And why would I give that caveat? Well, I may say understanding of the HTA world. I may even be provocative or offensive towards the HTA world, but I listened to the first webinar, and perhaps there's some general misunderstandings and stereotypes about the different communities that it's actually useful to bring out and discuss in the open. Where to start? I firmly of the view that assessments of quality, safety, efficacy, and benefit risk that are conducted by the regulators, and assessments of cost effectiveness and value in some sense, translated into whether or not to give a medicine a price in the context of a local market, are both fundamentally important decisions. And it's very clear that it's easier to centralize that regulatory assessment of quality, safety, or efficacy than it is to centralize a HTA assessment where the local context is so very important. I don't actually have a strong feeling as to whether both of those important questions are addressed under one roof or under separate roofs. I think, Lisa, you showed AIFA, you showed the Norwegian Medicines Agency, where different types of regulators both sit in the same building. And Carol, I'm sure you remember, Lisa as well, I'm sure when NICE was set up, there was quite a big discussion as to whether everyone should be under one roof or whether NICE should be an entirely distinct body, and the decision was made for the latter. No problem. But this is something of a double-edged sword. It meant that when these two worlds came together, there was a real demand to respect each other's jurisdictions. And Lisa, you'll remember this from the parallel scientific advice in the early days of parallel science. The regulators have, the HTAs have to act as HTAs. And then it's not a big surprise that those worlds don't always coincide and those needs don't always coincide. Indeed, you know, as regulators, we were sort of invited and required to stick very closely to our legislative criteria. And regulators are driven by the legislative basis for their benefit risk decisions. Excuse me. So on the one hand, we get clarity of criteria, but on the other hand, it makes it harder to understand the world in which the other person lives in, harder to understand their processes, their requirements, etc., etc. I see a couple of sort of fundamental aspects where the world don't sit coherently together. And one is the assessment of value. What need look like? And again, I listened to some of the first webinar, and if I was going to provocatively stereotype, I would say a HTA only ever wants a product that makes people live longer or improves EQ5D. It's not true, I'm being deliberately provocative, yeah. Whereas the stereotype of the regulator is anything with a p-value less than 0.05. And of course, both of them are not true, but I think value is seen in a different way. And I don't know if we have some sort of confirmation bias, but I think the experts that the different systems use, that may be expert physicians, it may be expert patients, it may be a confirmation bias, but the HTA might find experts that agree with their line of thinking, the regulator might find experts that agree with their line of thinking. And I think it's far from true to say that every patient input, every external physician input would make those same criticisms of the FDA handling of new oncology treatments, for example. And it would be really interesting to discuss some approvals that have been made on intermediate endpoints or something more closely related to the disease than its impact on survival times or quality of life. I think that's one really interesting discussion. And the other is about evidence per se, and the regulator, I think, feeling more able to make scientifically justified extrapolations beyond a population that's been studied in a pivotal trial, which my perception is the HTA sometimes finds harder to do. And of course, then it's incumbent on the regulator to be able to explain that decision. And perhaps that's something we can come on to later in talking about how the two systems might evolve. So Lisa, last intervention, you asked the question about whether the systems are appropriate, functional, and balanced. And I didn't understand balance, so I'm not going to talk to balance. Are they appropriate? Yes, both of these questions are extremely important. I believe both stakeholder groups believe they are trying to serve society in the way that they make their decisions. I believe the impact of political pressure, industry pressure, etc., is minimal. I believe both stakeholder groups genuinely believe they're doing the best they can for the patients and the society that they serve. It is appropriate also that regulators stick very strictly to their legal basis. We can't change regulation to meet the needs of HTA without changing the regulation that underpins the the regulatory decision making. Is it functional? Well, that's a really interesting question because it works. New products are coming through. New products are being agreed and priced by HTA, not all of them. New products are being endorsed and authorized by regulators, not all of them. Is it functional? Yes. Is it perfect? No, not even close. Yeah. And balanced, I don't understand. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Rob. So Rick, what would be your input?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, also for having me. And I think I might open the floor also with sort of the academic perspective from the research that we've done on the similarities and differences between regulation and HTA. And I think one of the things that we found when we looked at the assessments of these organizations is that when they assess the same drug within the same indication, that they actually often highlight the same issues and the same uncertainties. In the vast majority of cases, the issues that they highlight in the evidence are actually the same between these organizations. So I think this might also be sort of a nice starting point to realize that it's not all about the differences between the stakeholder groups, but we also have a lot of commonalities. And one specific example is for when we've looked at the orphan designation by the Committee for Orphan Medicinal Products at EMA, and we've compared that to relative effectiveness assessments of HTA organizations. This was a part of the EMA UNETA work plan, and we found that actually in almost all these cases, the issues that were highlighted in these for these drugs were the same. So these evaluations actually are very similar in the majority of cases, and we've also found that when regulators already highlight really large uncertainties in their evaluation, then we find that this is associated with more regular negative HTA decisions or reimbursement decisions. So that emphasizes the point that when you already struggle in the regulatory domain, then you can expect more struggles downstream, which is, I think, a very good argument to make sure that we address uncertainties very early. And I think this sort of brings me to a concept or a framework that I like, which is the drug life cycle, where we think about actually more prospectively the interaction and the planning of the drug life cycle, where we very early in the process we have dialogues between stakeholders, and we know also from previous research that when regulators and HTA organizations give recommendations to manufacturers within joint scientific advice or parallel consultation, that they often can agree on the recommendations that they want to give, and also that the manufacturer often incorporates those suggestions. So that's a way to streamline evidence generation during the drug life cycle, which might prevent some of the issues that we get where regulators, I think, as Rob also hinted at, that regulators find something from the benefit risk balance perspective acceptable, but HTA organizations find that when they actually need to really quantify the added benefit versus the best available therapy, that they are not so positive. And we've seen that in especially when we looked at expedited pathways, where many of these drugs get negative reimbursement recommendations. And then I think another phase of the drug life cycle where I think we can really improve is the phase after the initial decisions. So after the first decision on market authorization has been made and the first reimbursement decision, then we find that we want to develop more evidence, but we know from the regulatory domain that it is often quite difficult to timely generate additional evidence. And we see that now also with the introduction of performance-based managed entry agreements in the HTA arena, where we also have lots of examples of not such successful schemes where we struggle to get the evidence that we want. So I think there's definitely some room for improvement. Then I think the final thing that I would like to mention is that when we talk about the cooperation between regulation and HTA, at least in the European arena, you always also have to consider the cooperation between HTA organizations, because you cannot compare the EMA with a single HTA organization. And I think that complicates, I think, the situation a bit more, but we also cannot deny it, I think. Cannot ignore it. Yeah.
Thank you, Rick. We have a first comment/question from the audience, which I will read, and then Dan, you can tackle the response to Francois, or we can come back to Francois after you want to comment to Rick's point. So Francois writes that he thinks that the system of authorization, regulation, reimbursement of medicines is very confusing for patients. A lot of products authorized by regulators are subsequently knocked down by the HTA bodies. Would it be much more effective to authorize fully effective transformative products, which would eventually have a greater probability of being reimbursed by national healthcare systems? My question back to Francois, where would you take those products to begin with? And then how would we know? Because a lot of times we don't know because we need more time. But Dan, would you like to begin? Maybe cover both in response to Rick and maybe comment to Francois's comment, and then Vaya.
Yeah, so I'll try to respond to both Rick and Rob, and maybe my answer to Francois at this point, if you'll bear with me, is yes, a qualified yes. Of course, we want truly effective transformative therapies because that will improve population health, and that is certainly a place where regulators and HTA are joined at the hip. So a few comments, and this is obviously coming from the US perspective. And for those of you not that familiar, ICER is the most visible HTA body in the US, but it does not have any official mandate. So its activity basically has to be tied to the regulatory timeline for decisions. Because in the US, when regulatory authorization is given, then market uptake essentially starts the next day. So in the role that ICER plays, and so I've been collaborating with them on reviews, even though I'm in an academic setting now, there has to be a lot of guesswork about what looks like a good bet, what looks like it's going to make it through the regulatory process. And I have to say, with all due respect to the approach that regulators take generally, when I'm thinking about the FDA, I feel a bit like I'm in my 20s and dating again, because I'm always trying to guess what the other party's thinking. So as an example, I'm currently engaged with ICER on a review of a product, a compound, investigational compound, that was studied in a relatively robust, randomized, double-blind setting. The comparator is the active standard of care, so it's not a placebo. The primary endpoint was met. All of the secondary endpoints were met. Some potential safety signals, but on an overall basis, the benefit risk profile looked to be very favorable. There was a lot of public buzz about this product. The company a few days ago received a complete response letter from the FDA. So that is a rejection, in other words. And while the contents of that letter are confidential, one of the elements that leaked out was that the FDA was interested. This was a novel method of action, and the FDA was interested in a second trial to replicate those findings. So that made me feel like I was in a time warp, and we were 20 years ago when this is what the FDA said routinely. And in contrast, some of the decisions that Lisa spoke about, like the aducanumab decision, are completely on the other end of the spectrum. So I think that where there is alignment, and as Rick talked about, where the the uncertainties are greatest coming out of the regulatory conversation. That tends to be where HTA decisions are more negative. That's one way to think about it, and that's certainly a pattern that we see worldwide. But if HTA has an expectation that the regulator is going to act in one way and then it's completely opposite of what's expected, then it's really hard to know what to do from the HTA community's perspective.
Thank you, Dan. So then we give word to Vaya, then Rob and Carol.
Thank you, Lisa, and also thank you to Rick and Rob for your reflections. I wanted to take a step back, and also I see that Anja responded in the chat about the need for horizon scanning, and that was also exactly what I was going to raise, because we were talking about, I mean, Rob was talking about that the system is appropriate and that the system is addressing the needs of the society, but I would challenge that because it's product driven, because everything that goes through the system is because it's technology push. It's not necessarily what we need as a society. So it might be appropriate, but it might be appropriate from a certain perspective, and that's something I would like to discuss also with the panelists. And my urge indeed would be also to look at the horizon scanning systems, but not necessarily from a product perspective, but also from a societal perspective. So what are the trends that we see and why certain contexts might need certain products more, are more needed than in others. And I'm also a bit concerned about the system as it is now, because what I see, especially in middle income countries, is that because we have managed entry agreement schemes, at least they accept lower evidence in order to have a policy instrument like managed entry agreements, to have the push, for example, for high cost drugs, for example, oncology products, for example, in Kazakhstan or in Ukraine, well, their essential medicines list is not up to date at all. So I think there's something wrong in the system, and I'm not quite sure if I have the answers, but I think it's also because we have the system in place. So there is a kind of expectation, because we have the regulatory space, and so we have the technology push, and then people want to have indeed those products, not necessarily because they address the needs of the society, because it's also possible through certain policy instruments. And they, of course, look at our countries as well. So I have some challenges back to maybe Rob and Rick in terms of, there are, of course, possibilities in how HTA can align with the regulatory space, which is fine. But I think there is fundamentally something challenging in our system, in our ecosystem. And if we look at also at HTA from an ecosystem, I'm not quite sure if we address what we should address.
Thank you, Vaya. So Rob, Carol, and then Ray.
So hi, Francois and Anja. Do we want transformative therapies? Yeah, I'm with Dan. Of course, everyone wants transformative therapies. Actually, the interesting question, though, I guess, is how do you want them and when do you want them? How soon should they be placed on the market and with what uncertainty? If we are truly thinking we are addressing an unmet medical need with a medicine that's potentially transformative, how long should you delay and wait for that evidence before regulators and HTA make their decision? What's the point at which that decision should be made? And that's the challenging discussion, and the argument that regulators are sometimes too quick and the argument that HTA is sometimes too slow. I should have said, by the way, I do think both stakeholders have incredibly important jobs and incredibly difficult jobs. If I had to pick, the HTA job is even more difficult because the regulator has to say benefit is bigger than risk. Fine. The HTA then has to go and put that into a value. It has to be quantified and valued. And I think that is the tougher part of this. I don't only want transformative therapies, though. I want alternatives. I want products with incremental benefits. I don't only want transformative therapies. And when we're working at the margins with companies who are pushing for the best price possible, I don't blame them for that. But that's, I guess, the HTA's role. And sometimes the HTA will have to say no. the company hasn't brought forward a dossier that substantiates the value of the product. There is nothing that enables a regulator to turn down a product that has a positive benefit risk. And in the end, you judge the product, not the development plan. So even if scientific advice was not listened to and the company went a different way about it, the clinical trial design may not be perfect. In the end, you have to scientifically judge the product and its benefit risk, not the development plan. I think you're absolutely right. Of course, the system is driven by push. And to some extent, that's not surprising, is it? Because developments in healthcare have to be driven by technology and have to be driven by science. We can all say, this is the big medical need. But if there's no scientific answer to address that medical need, it will remain a medical need until the science does exist. And the companies are out there looking for the technology and the science. Where I think we can do in a resource-constrained environment, and maybe we'll talk a bit more about scientific advice later on, in a resource-constrained environment, we can put our resources where we do want to try and pull a product through the system. And that's to some extent what Prime tries to do, what the Accelerated Access Collaborative in the UK tried to do, and how parallel scientific advice might be best targeted.
Thank you, Rob. Carol?
Thanks, Lisa, and hello to all of the panel, and thanks for the opportunity for this discussion. I'm struggling to know what to say because there is so much that we can say about this topic. It's really difficult to think about where to focus things. But I'm going to start perhaps with Rob's point about the different functions, and I think he makes a really important point that we mustn't lose. The development of all new technologies is a journey, and along that journey there are important decision points, and those decision points are both necessary and useful. And I think we have to respect that. We have to respect that companies are making decisions about what they're going to invest their resources in. Healthcare systems are making decisions about what priorities they want to signal. And then in a sense, the officers, the agencies that have to try to get a handle on the introduction of new technologies also have to play a very discreet and a very specific role. So recognizing those territorial boundaries, if I could put it that way, is really important. Having said that, if I think back to quite a while back at NICE, we're looking at 10, 15 years ago. So this is not a current problem that we're talking about. We realized that two things. One, if we were so late undertaking our HTA compared to a regulatory approval, we're not really adding a lot of value to the system. That delay in an HTA signal, an HTA decision was becoming a really problematic. And so as an HTA organization, we decided we are going to have to pull ourselves back as close as we possibly can to that regulatory decision in order to be the most effective in our own work. So it's nothing about what the regulators have done, it's realizing your own place in the ecosystem and realizing that gap between a regulatory approval and an HTA decision isn't good for everyone. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we realized was that it wasn't very productive for an HTA organization just to talk about how problematic the regulatory environment was and how things that were happening in the regulatory environment weren't useful for subsequent HTA. So we took the decision, we have to start understanding that environment in order to be able to, quite honestly, influence how the handover between a regulatory decision into an HTA environment could be optimized. That's why NICE Scientific Advice started, and all that, and the greater increased conversations between regulators and HTA bodies began. So the key point is that it's probably less useful to talk about the misalignment and more useful to talk about how do you optimize handover? How do you optimize what's coming through for the subsequent part of the journey? It's a bit like a relay race, right from the beginning, from the original science to getting something useful into the hands of people that really need it. And if you do not have those handovers, well, not just aligned, but understanding what they need to do in order to hand over efficiently, then you do not have, firstly, you do not have a whole system thinking, and absolutely you do not have an efficient framework. And therefore, my thought would be, how do we further energize the key players in the ecosystem? That's not just regulators and HTA bodies, but the key players in the ecosystem to realize and therefore do something about the fact that we have to have that handover in the most effective way possible. And hopefully we can explore some of those this evening.
Thank you, Carol. So Rick and then Eric and Dan. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, maybe a brief response also to Carol's point, which I think was a very, very good one, that there is, like, from a patient perspective, I think it's quite incomprehensible that might be a very large delay between a regulatory decision and an HTA decision, wherein that patient does not have access to a therapy during that phase. And I think I totally agree that we should try to minimize the lag here and make this relay race as efficient as possible. And I think it also extends, of course, beyond the HTA part into the involvement of clinicians and the patient as well. But that's not the focus of today, of course. But I think maybe one way to further enhance this transfer from regulation to HTA is more conversations early. And I emphasize this again, that the early dialogues between these different stakeholders and the sharing of information, explaining to each other why you make certain decisions based on what considerations, that really helps with the what I think it really helps with the smooth transition from regulation to HTA. And then some earlier points that were made was this point about unmet medical need, where we say, well, at the moment, drug development is not really driven by unmet medical needs that exist or not solely driven by unmet medical needs that exist in society. And I think that is something that we also might want to focus on a bit more in the future, where we say, well, actually, these are the unmet medical needs that we really would like to see addressed, and maybe even formulate what you then expect with respect to the evidence that you want to have generated for drugs addressing those unmet medical needs. Even maybe come to agreement on the endpoints, what constitutes a clinically relevant effect. All these things can be discussed already in advance, I think, between the different stakeholder groups. I think Rob mentioned that we judge the product and not the development plan. I think that's true. I also think that we often do consider some aspects beyond the product, right? For example, eligibility to an expedited pathway is often you need to address a high unmet medical need to be eligible, for example, for the conditional marketing authorization scheme in Europe. And I think this definition of addressing high unmet medical needs is actually quite vague. And I think coming to more agreement on how stringent that those criteria for unmet medical need would have to be might also help the alignment between regulators and HTA organizations. And maybe coming back to some comments in the chat, I think this is also part of the pharmaceutical legislation review, the place of unmet medical need and the definition of unmet medical need within the regulation.
Thank you, Rick. I'll give a word to Eric in just a second. I do think it's very interesting that Rob raised an issue whether we judge the product or the development plan or not. So, and whether development plan should be judged. And this is, I think, very important question. So if some of you can comment on that, and it depends what's under the development plan. Is it number of trials? Is this type of trials? Is this the timelines? And I think the biggest problem we are seeing now is we wish we paid a lot more attention to the development plan and sort of influenced it early on, because if a proper comparative trial could have been done while we pushed for, allowed for through regulatory pathway for an expedited path through a single arm, quick, small trial, this brings a lot of harm to then HTA process where we're lacking this comparative evidence, which could have been generated. We do have technologies where it's impossible. So whether this kind of dialogue can happen early on to maybe to influence that, to actually demonstrate whether those products are transformative rather than looking at overall response rate and hyping a product after phase 2, which results in nothing after phase 3. So, Eric, your comments, and then Dan.
Thanks, Lisa. Like Carol said, there's been so many good points. It's very hard to know where to jump in and kind of where to focus. But I'll do my very best. So I think the first thing is that patients deserve better of all the system players. It's on the outside kind of looking in, it's really crazy, the silos, the disconnects that are in the system, and the lack of a relationship between demand and supply. It's just nuts, and it needs to be fixed. So the answer lies in a systems approach. The answer lies in getting the right legislation and the right remit for each stakeholder in the system. As I said previously, until we get vested interests unified around a common goal, which is delivering benefit and value to patients, and we get the right incentives and rewards in the system, it will not work, because all the players just do what they do without that alignment. So we kind of need to think about it in a systems approach, and the really analogy, of course, is right. But in any system, and unless the inputs are good, the outputs are going to be so rubbish in, rubbish out. So each stakeholder needs to think carefully around their role in that really, to make sure that, and notwithstanding the commercial interests, investor interests, regulatory interests, they need to do their very best to generate the right data at that stage to pass on to the next decision maker. And that comes a little bit back to is the system looking at the product or the development plan? And of course it looks at the product, and it shouldn't. It should look at the development plan, because it's the development plan that will ensure that the right questions are addressed at the right time point, and the right evidence is generated for the appropriate decision maker in the system. It's not the job of the system, particularly when things come to HTA, to mark poor homework. So in a UK perspective, there are lots of flexibilities, and this is where, and I think it was Rob, is I actually think the influence of pharma on decision making is massive. You know, if I think about it in the UK context, the impact that the voluntary scheme has had on NICE is massive. I mean, NICE are in the tightest corner you can imagine, largely because of industry pressure and patient group pressure, some of which has been reflected in the VPAS. And the more that flexibilities are built into HTA impaired decision making to take account of not factual uncertainties, so uncertainties that nobody could have done anything about, but uncertainties that have arisen because the wrong decisions have been made, the wrong questions have been asked, the wrong decision, the decision makers requested kind of different things. It's not the HTA or payer's job to fix that through flexibilities of managed access, performance outcome schemes. These should be reserved for people who have done a very, very good job of developing the evidence. It shouldn't be to fix that problem. And we should push them back and say, look, you need to go back actually and fix your development program because the system can't bend enough and shouldn't flex enough to mark your bad homework. Patients deserve better, but the problem is patients don't know any better because I think Francois' point about the confusion, they don't understand how can a regulator deem a drug to be safe and effective and an HTA body say, actually there's huge uncertainties around how good is that drug, and we really don't know if it's safe because we've only got 6 months follow-up from a phase 2 study. It makes no sense. One other point I'll make, and this comes back to Rick's point about life cycle management, which is something that I have been a huge proponent of for my entire career, is that one regulatory trial can't answer all the questions that the system needs and the different decision makers need. A regulatory trial is set up to answer regulatory questions. It doesn't matter if these questions are clinically relevant and plausible to patients and health systems around the world. So we need to think about evidence development as a package, actually, because we can't answer all the questions the system needs in one regulatory study. And we need to think about, I think Rick mentioned it, medicines optimization, is that, and again, I reflect on the UK, particularly England, is we have consequential clinical pathways. So we have these pathways that are constructed by random bits of marketing authorization for drugs designed largely for a US market, and we shoehorn them into consequential pathways. They're not state-of-the-art optimal kind of pathways. So this idea that Rick mentioned is post-marketing authorization, post-HTA approval, there's still a massive job to do to shape coherent, plausible, and sensible and patient-centric clinical pathways in the real world. And we're so bad at collecting data on these clinical pathways, whether they're consequential or state-of-the-art, that we're not then putting that information and intelligence back into the system to further improve evidence development. So there's just a few, I guess, comments on what's been said and some additional points for discussion.
Thank you, Eric. Dan?
Thanks, and Eric, great comments. I am thinking, I was going to be introducing my comments along a systems perspective already, and so you've actually given me more to think about, so I'm trying to process real time. But so one of the things that strikes me, and in the US, we don't have any formal early scientific advice or parallel advice. Even the closest thing we have at the national level is parallel review, the regulator and the major public payer, CMS. But that activity has been extremely limited, not focused on drugs at all, only on diagnostics. There are a lot of political and logistical reasons behind that. But one of the things that strikes me as an observer is that there may be beneficial conversations that happen, but they're at the margin, and there is potential for significant information loss, even when HTA is then appraising something that it has given early advice on, or regulators are then reviewing something they've given early advice on, or even within and across product teams at manufacturers. Could we, as a group, envision the notion of an international collaborative that involves those in the regulatory and the HTA community coming together in kind of a consensus development format, maybe even professional society driven. So Vaya, as president of HTA, I am looking at you. To identify areas where considerations around measurement, outcomes, populations are relatively well established, to develop some consensus guidance for industry that's replicable across products that can be used broadly. And for those areas where there's more uncertainty, maybe even try to break those up into manageable bits. So there's been a lot of conversation in the chat going on about the orphan drug legislation, both in the US and in Europe, and how there is the potential for perverse incentives and abuses. But that could mean that this consensus group then works on elements of orphan populations that are addressable. So those orphan diseases that don't have challenges necessarily with measurement or with such rarity that trial enrollment could be compromised or things like that, to try to develop guidance that again is replicable across studies. And then put in some additional guidance for those areas where measurement is still a challenge. Accelerated pathways and creative solutions to manage entry need to be considered. But try to take the lion's share of the concerns out of the equation by developing this guidance proactively. I would love to hear what people think about that.
Thank you, Dan. So Rick and then Vaya.
Yeah, I think actually I can be quite brief because I completely agree with Dan. I think this prospectively defining what we actually want to see as regulators, as HTA bodies, I think that's immensely important. I think it's also maybe a bit unrealistic to expect that manufacturers come up with an extremely comprehensive evidence package when we know that you can get regulatory approval and also get some form of reimbursement with a way less comprehensive evidence package. So I think it's also a bit unfair towards manufacturers to say, well, you haven't given us the evidence that we want when you've never made that clear what you would want within a certain disease area or for a certain group of patients. So I think specifying what you would expect and then also sticking to it and being more critical if you don't get what you have specified is immensely important. Yeah, and then I think Dan also mentioned the accelerated approval, and I think managed entry agreements were mentioned also a few times before. And I think, yeah, these evidence generation post these initial decisions, these processes should be more aligned, I think, because yeah, everybody struggles to get the right evidence, but still everybody also requests their own evidence to address their own questions, and that is also not very efficient, I think. So I think we should try to align that a bit more. And one, I think, good argument is also that regulators, I think, have struggled to force manufacturers to come up with evidence in a timely fashion, also because it's quite difficult to revoke a marketing authorization based on a delay in the generation of evidence, right? So, but I think this is an opportunity for collaboration between regulators and HTA organizations, because it is easier, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's easier to link a lack of evidence generation to the price of a drug. So you might envision a scheme where the price is actually linked to whether the evidence that is needed is developed in a timely fashion.
Thank you, Rick. There was very interesting comment and a question from Rita in a chat about increase in scientific advice in the EMA and whether quality of submissions or understanding improved. maybe Rob, you can remember from your experience, because I think we tried to measure it, I understand it at NICE, and you felt overall that things are getting better. And then you get a briefing book where you realize that they're not. So it really depended on some companies. There's a bit of internal learning going on through parallel processes. I think HTA agencies learned a lot and exchanged a lot of information. So there's huge value in that. How much it improved industry, it's patchy because it improved some organizations a lot while it didn't improve others. So, but it would be interesting to hear from regulatory perspective. So Rob, then Vaya, Carol, and Eric.
I think, largely speaking, companies understand what regulatory standards look like. There are indications where it's appropriate still to do a regular development plan that includes phase 1, phase 2, dose finding, proof of concept, multiple phase 3 trials, and plan for post-authorization, evidence generation, and life cycle. There's other indications where that's simply not feasible. You can try and generate all of your evidence in one shot and get away with a single phase 3 trial, etc. There's even some beyond that where you might be able to show efficacy and benefit risk of your product on a smaller data set. And I think those are the ones that we're kind of mostly discussing around. But companies use scientific advice, not so much to understand what the regulatory standards are, but to try and test them, to try and push them, to see, can we do something a bit smaller, a bit quicker? Do we really have to do X, Y, Z? And so there'll always be that, lens through which you have to look at scientific advice type interactions. The history of the parallel scientific advice, I think, has been a positive one, but it's not been an easy ride. Lisa, you know it as well as I do in Europe, from those early interactions where you had the big EMA scientific advice working party machine, and people dropped into that conversation from different HTA or payer bodies around Europe with ideas on what the target population would look like in their region, what the comparator would look like in their region, etc., etc. An almost impossible task for the company to reconcile all of it. So we gradually moved more towards UNETA. And perhaps that got closer down to this idea of let's apply a consistent standard and line of thinking from the HTA bodies that we could actually learn to use and generalize from. But then capacity becomes an issue. And I think UNETA call for, is it 8 or 12 procedures per year? And EMA Scientific Advice and Anya, who's in the chat, are running 60, 80, I don't know how many now, per month of these discussions. It's a big old world out there to try and get every single development program streamlined and harmonized across all of the stakeholders. Not to say it's not worth trying, just to highlight the operational challenge of doing so. I'm sort of concerned, Dan and Rick, you both talked about it, and Eric, loads of great points, but perhaps I disagree a bit on this one. I fear a world where regulators and HTAs write down what a development program should look like and what a drug effect should look like. An industry have to go and meet those standards, because I think things will get gold plated and sort of highest common denominator. Now, it's fine to say this is what a product looked like that I would pay this much money for, but I don't think you could ever say this is what a product would look like, otherwise I won't approve it. Because again, I value small benefits, incremental benefits, alternatives for prescribers and patients coming forward to the market. That gold plating aspect. And honestly, I mean, let's take the most difficult example that everyone likes to criticize. A company bringing forward a drug in oncology based on shrinking the tumor for a durable amount of time, okay, and a relatively small safety database. Well, the regulatory standard has been to try and authorize that product in patients who have no other good treatment options. I can't say that's wrong for the regulator to place the product on the market that shows a durable shrinkage of a patient's cancer. I can't say it's wrong for the regulator to do that and to make that product authorized with the possibility for patients to use it. I can understand if the HTA says, I'm not prepared to pay X £100,000 out of my healthcare budget for that. I can understand that perfectly well, but I can't say the regulator is wrong in placing that product on the market.
Thank you, Rob. Very useful and practical comments. Very interesting challenge from Heidi, a question in the chat. So while Vaya, Carol, and Eric providing their comments, it would be great to hear your perspectives on Heidi's comment as well.
Thanks, Lisa. I haven't read Heidi's comment yet, but I just wanted I agree with what Rob was saying. I'm struggling a bit with, I think that was also mentioned in the chat, is indeed, I think that HTA agencies and regulatory agencies understand something different, what they want to see as an outcome. So, I mean, Rick was trying to say, okay, maybe we can, you know, give industry more clear expectations, but the expectations are different because the risk-benefit assessment is something different than what HTA assessment are asking for when they recommend or make a decision with regard to pricing and reimbursement or even procurement. So I think there has to be more alignment, and I think we were talking about this. Parallel scientific advice could of course be a kind of maybe a solution for this, but still, even though I'm quite challenging whether we as a HTA community really understand the same bar of evidence compared to the regulators. So I'm struggling a bit with this common language. Do we really have the same problem, and are we also looking at the same solution? So, and I'm not quite sure about this, and because when I hear Rob talking, he's correct, because he says, you know, industry knows what we are asking for, because this is all very well laid out and it's very well regulated. It's true, but of course what we are asking from an HTA perspective is something different. So what the industry has to provide to the regulatory agency is also something different than when they come to a national HTA authority, and then we are asking something different. So of course there is indeed misalignment, and the question is, can we indeed make that more optimal from the beginning? And I'm not quite sure, because the regulatory agency has another remit than an HTA agency. So I'm still struggling with this, and of course we can try to optimize this, and this is also what we are trying to do. And I wanted to make a comment that DIA is now also collaborating with HTA, at least to see what are the issues, and do we have the same issues, and can we come up with solutions to address, for example, uncertainty, especially at the HTA and the regulatory interface. But I'm not quite sure, because I still think we are not talking in the same language, and I think we should focus a bit more on this. Coming back to Dan's point, I mean, of course, collaboration is great, and I think Jonetta already has done quite some important work in this, and I also saw Anja's response that it is not easy and it is time consuming to get everybody aligned, also even within Europe. But yeah, so I'm not quite sure how we could do this. Sorry, I have no answers.
Carol?
Yes, and I'm not sure I'm going to give you any answers either, because it is quite a knotty issue. And what I'm going to say now is going to be quite simplistic, but hopefully the concepts it will help us work through. And I'm concentrating still on this handover. You know, if we can find a good way to hand over from one part of the journey to the other, it would be much better. And I'll give you again simplistically, if you think about the way the regulators, the remit of the regulators, you know, does a medicine work? Does it work? Is its risk benefit positive? If you think about the HTA, again, caricaturing, how well does it work? So we're looking at magnitude of effect. Okay, so those two things are actually quite useful things to know individually. It would be quite useful also to have some connectivity between those things. So does it work? How well does it work? In that handover from does it work to how well it works, let's take an example. Rob's brought it out already, of the use of a surrogate endpoint in answering the question, does it work? We can use that surrogate endpoint and be able to some conclusions on does it work based on the surrogate endpoint, but you probably need to explain why that surrogate endpoint can be used for a does it work decision. Are we explaining that sufficiently well enough? Because that's very useful when it's moving into the how well does it work context. And the issue with that move from does it work to how well does it work is that I might not be able to get a handle on how well it works from that surrogate as easily as the question, does it work at all? So very, very simplistic issue about handover, hopefully gives you an example of the problem, and we've still not fixed that one between regulatory and HTA. Is there not a way of being able to at least come to some consensus between regulators and HTA agencies on the use of surrogates and in what circumstances, and possibly even qualifying them from an HTA and a regulatory perspective? Now, I know I could be rather heretical to some of my HTA colleagues in even contemplating the use of a surrogate in an HTA environment, but if there is a relationship, a proven relationship between a surrogate and a final endpoint, you have at least some scientific validity for being able to accept it for the final outcome that an HTA body might be interested in. So there's some way of being able to align and, as a consequence, have a much smoother handover between a regulator and an HTA environment. So I'm just offering that as, you know, we talk about it in the macro level. Let's do consensus documents. Let's try to. I think we're talking too large. I think we should get down into some very, very tangible, very small things that regulators and HTA bodies can align, and then from that, hopefully, we will start to understand our language a little bit better.
Thank you, Carol. I think it's a very good challenge. And if we look back at history, what has been done, everyone was coming to the table with their own story, and we practically did not dig into any joint methodological work. And the big question is, are the parties ready to that level of interaction, or they're just ready to sit at the table and everyone preaching their truth and then figure out why they don't agree? So that would be a very interesting initiative, I think, which could be led by ICH or by UNETA or joint efforts. So Eric, your comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Again, lots of great points and discussions. I'm going to do my very best to articulate 3 points succinctly that hopefully will help answer some of the questions that have come in. So the first one is that I think part of the solution, lies with patients and patient advocacy, because nothing happens without patients. Research mostly will not happen without kind of patients. And I would say, on the whole, patients are in a difficult position regarding research, but they lack knowledge and are naive. I think local, regional, and global advocacy too is often not fit for purpose because it's not advocating for the right things. I think if patient organizations and advocacy groups truly understood what was happening in the system, they wouldn't stand for it. And I think the change agents has to be advocacy. So the more that we can educate, empower, explain, and provide evidence to patients and patient advocacy to change the system, and that's mostly, it all goes back to government sometimes, because a lot of it is about legislation. And all the different actors and players just work within the rules that they're given. So I think there needs to be a huge effort from a patient advocacy perspective and the representatives of patients to up their game and actually become a stronger voice and more of an honest broker in the system. The second thing is going back to sort of Rob's point about gold-plated, which is well made, and I agree. And I guess the point I was trying to make is that just in the context of that better relationship between demand and supply, the more that the demand side understands what it needs, what it wants, the better it can articulate that with more strength and less flexibilities, the wrong types of flexibilities at their decision-making time better. And what I would say is that we shouldn't be seeking perfection. So perfection is the enemy of the good. I think that's a saying. But actually, if we aim for marginal gains and marginal improvements with every stakeholder, at every step in the system, it will be transformative at the bedside. So that's what we should be aiming for. It's not system change, it's impossible, but looking at how we can better connect the dots and looking and incentivizing and advocating and brokering for marginal improvements at each step in the system. And maybe that's a bit idealistic and naive, but I think that should be where we start. And the third point, which is slightly different to what I think is being said, is, and I think Heidi may have brought this up in the chat, I'm not very good at multitasking, it listening, concentrating and reading at the same time. It should the burden of evidence development be entirely on the shoulders of industry, and should the system trust industry, and I don't mean that in a negative context necessarily, trust industry with the responsibility of producing all the evidence that decision makers need. And with this move towards, at least in a nice perspective, is looking at the totality of the evidence, obviously with a randomized phase 3 study that's clinically relevant, well-designed, the right endpoints, being at the top of the tree. Is there a role for academic and medical research, charity-funded research, to actually share some of the burden, particularly at a local level where different HTA pair bodies might need different evidence to set it in a national context? So again, looking at an England and a UK perspective, it's always struck me of the complete disconnect between the incentives and drivers for academic research compared to the decisions that NICE have to make about evidence. And I'm on record as saying this several times, so apologies for being repetitive, is I sat on the board of the National Cancer Research Institute for 6 years or so, and I kept asking the same question, is can you give me metrics to let me know the extent to which the results of NIHR, NIHR-funded, NCRI badge trials have materially changed clinical practice in any cancer? So what they can say is, yeah, we funded this many trials, this many patients went into trials, but they can't tell you what happened to the results and the extent to which these results changed clinical practice, because there's no commissioning pathway for the results of academic research unless you've got marketing authorization, and unless you've got a NICE badge, there's no obligation of the health system to kind of pay for it. So what contribution can academic research play to reducing uncertainty in generating evidence? And I think that's an untapped potential to help solve the problem. And actually government should be incentivizing academic groups and incentivizing medical research charities to actually think about the relevance and plausibility of the research they're doing, change the incentives, change the metrics, and actually get them to contribute to reducing uncertainty and getting better evidence into the system to support decision making.
Eric, thank you for bringing excellent points. And we had this challenge in the first seminar. I think Ian Panico, Frank brought it up, saying we should have trials running, let's say, in parallel, led by non-industry partners. The question is, would industry trust that side before the marketing authorization, because we only see, if we see any non-industry trials in the post-marketing authorization phase, I'm talking not academics doing the trials on behalf of industry, but actually independent trials. So it's a huge gap, and it's fantastic you raised it. And the question is, we have it now, not enough, but in the wrong timing zone. So, and moving it, amalgamating it earlier in the pathway, and actually having these outcomes that change practice is extremely, extremely important. So Dan and then Rob.
Great. Rob may have been first, I'm not sure, but so just following up on one of Eric's very good points. So in my vision for this approach, I was thinking about something like a core outcome set driven group of exercises, but not in a traditional sense, in a sense where patient input is oversampled or overweighted or both. Because I think trying to understand exactly how the patient experience translates into both what has been measured and what should be measured is critically important. But in terms of the output of the exercise itself, I was thinking more in terms of, I don't know if this is a rugby term or not, basic blocking and tackling, right? So, and holding everyone's feet to the fire. So if a regulator is saying for a new anti-diabetic that potentially has cardiovascular benefit, we need to see results of a cardiovascular outcomes trial before we make a decision. That guidance has been out there for a while, but the decision-making is now in advance of those results in many cases. Or, bringing in the Alzheimer's example again, if you're going to measure benefit primarily on the back of a fancy clinical instrument that is never used in clinical practice, then at least take one of those clinical instruments that is used in clinical practice and make that a secondary endpoint. So it's kind of basic instruction. I'm thinking of a minimum standard that HTA and regulators can agree on, recognizing that there will always be a need for further information, particularly at the back end, but at least a starting point that industry can take as consistent guidance. And again, it's an individual company's decision as to whether they adhere to it or not, or argue for something different, but at least it's out there.
And I have a quick challenge, at least theoretically, I can imagine what Carol raised as kind of early methodological work, or to get into this kind of routine to give instruction to the industry so they think in this way. My challenge to you, what are the chances with FDA and anyone else on the plate of ever considering this? Because no matter what, even the drugs that we get to see in Europe, you can see just how much of a role FDA plays, and this is, it seems to be, it's the only target. And it's good if we get at least something else or something else, but that's the kind of perception you feel.
Well, I mean, like anything else, it's a leadership-driven culture. And so if the new commissioner who was previously the commissioner tries to bring some of that into play, then maybe we'll have those conversations. So yes, I agree that there has to be willing participation from all sides. I think one of the things I neglected to mention earlier is that, as Carol mentioned, we need to understand details about product development plans. We also need to understand details about product commercialization plans, right? We need to understand as a community when an IV drug is expected to go subcutaneous, when supplemental indications will be filed for after the initial indication's approved. Some of that may be unknown, but I think a lot of it is known. And right now it's held very closely to the vest.
Thank you, Dan. Rob?
Too many good points to have to pick up on, but perhaps the most important, Dan, is that you don't lock in rugby. That's illegal. Okay, just to have that clear. It's rude after not seeing Carol for so many years, but I'm going to pick you up on the words, Carol, just because I hope it's sort of illustrative for people listening. The regulatory decision will be based not only on does it work, but how well it works. That's inherent in the benefit-risk trade-off. There has to be a magnitude of benefit versus the risk. Of course, as I said in my opening comments, that doesn't mean that the regulator in HTA is agreeing on what benefit is and what value is, but there has to be that judgment of a clinically relevant effect that offsets the toxicities. A regulator will not, of course, go to the value of the product within a particular healthcare system, or even sort of relative value compared to other interventions outside certain specifics. The discussion around surrogates, I think, is fascinating. And to me, there is hardly any surrogate endpoints. When a regulator makes a decision based on tumours shrinking or delaying times to tumours progressing, or LDL levels or HbA1c or walking distance in Duchenne, it's not because of surrogacy per se, the idea that an effect on this endpoint of magnitude X will transfer into an effect on this endpoint of magnitude Y. It's because you see sufficient value in the effect on the what I call intermediate endpoint per se. And then let's use Alzheimer's that we've been talking about as an example. Should you authorize products because they reduce beta amyloid, because they reduce plaques? You can have a view on that. Should you authorize products because they change these artificial scales? Sorry, Dan, I've forgotten what word you used. Or should you actually wait until patients progress to some extent in their functional disability and develop perhaps full-blown Alzheimer's from a pre-dementia type of diagnosis at the start? And those are legitimate conversations to be had. This whole conversation that we're having today is not going to get easier as we go forwards. If you think, I'm not interested in commenting on the decision on Aduhelm, but Alzheimer's is a fascinating example because the science tells us to treat early. And the outcomes that we'd all like to know are probably 10 years down the line from that treatment. But I doubt anyone, including the patient community, wants 10-year RCTs before any treatments are made available. Let's ask, let's find out. But I personally doubt that. So you have to choose some time point for that access decision. But importantly, you should still have the evidence generation plans in place, whether it's continuations of the clinical trials or whether it's good epidemiology in clinical practice that eventually answer those questions, or answer those questions as soon as and as efficiently as possible. And where that's in everyone's interest, the regulators should be building that into the obligations for the marketing authorization or as recommendations to the marketing authorization. I think this discussion of the patient input is extremely important. But to me, the part that doesn't get discussed enough is how do you understand the perspective of an entire patient community? And I'm interested in understanding the breadth of perspectives across a patient. I believe there'll ever be one voice that says this is the endpoint that's important in that setting to all of these patients, or this risk is tolerable, or this effect size is acceptable. It must be about understanding the spectrum of views from a patient community as a whole, and stakeholders such as regulators and HTAs being aware of that spectrum of views when they take their decision. I can easily imagine there'll be some patients who really want regulators to approve drugs based on the fact that the tumour shrinks for a long time. And there'll be other patients that don't want to take a drug that causes grade 3, grade 4 toxicities until they've got a survival benefit. But that's not quantified. That breadth of opinion is not quantified. Just to finish on something more practical, I really like, unless we start with a blank sheet of paper and rewrite, Carol's focusing in on the right discussions and this handover. And I'm sure regulators can do better in assessment reports, particularly, as I say, around extrapolations that are made from clinical trial populations, perspectives on patient-reported outcomes, quality of life data, and detailed methodological assessments of those. perhaps needing to change this perspective that that type of endpoint is uninterpretable from basically uninterpretable from a single arm trial. And I really like the initiative at EMA to have sort of webinars, which was done at the time a product was approved. It was done as a pilot at the time a product was approved, and people could dial in and ask questions. Maybe there should be a shop for the relevant patient community, the relevant parts of the HTA and the regulators to have a discussion as to how shortly before it's approved, to start to talk about, well, these questions are not addressed, or I don't understand why you're going to do that, and make sure the products, the assessment report, and the post-authorization work is more fit for purpose for other stakeholders.
Thank you very much, Rob. Looks like we laid out all the problems to now actually start the discussion, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I very much appreciate our guest speakers today for their insights, and big thank you to our regular panel. This is a huge topic. We covered a lot of important points. I'm grateful to the amazing dialogue that we had in the chat this time around. All of these messages will be posted on our YouTube channel with all the helpful links that people provided. So we will have recording available for those of you who had to leave early or missed, or you can share this discussion. And from this particular topic, it's quite clear that we're just starting with trying to get somewhere. So a lot more dialogues need to take place, and actual actions, perhaps not by us, but to the people we can communicate this information. So, and our next event is in February. So it will be next year, and it will be on evaluation of processes and methods for HTA, but we would like to hear feedback from anyone listening. So do send us what questions you have, what other discussions you'd like to have. And yes, everything we discussed today will be documented, and our objective is to produce kind of outputs, guidance, wish lists, action lists for the future. So this is not the endpoint, this is the opening the door for future interactions. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening in Europe, good afternoon and on the other side of the ocean. Bye-bye.